There is a photograph taken sometime in the early 1970s. Lucille Ball is sitting at a table in a restaurant in Beverly Hills, and she is laughing, not performing a laugh, not the exaggerated double-take pratfall laugh that made her the most recognized comedian in television history, but genuinely laughing, shoulders up, eyes crinkled, at something one of her children has said. Her daughter Lucie is sitting beside her, and her son Desi is across the table, and they are a family having dinner. And for a moment the camera has caught them without the performance of being famous. It is the kind of photograph that is easy to pass by without stopping. Most people do not stop, because when you say the name Lucille Ball, the image that surfaces is not a woman at a restaurant table. It is a woman in a black and white factory scene, trying to keep up with a conveyor belt full of chocolates that has gone impossibly fast. It is a woman in a grape vat stomping with furious energy. It is a woman turning the simplest domestic situation into a catastrophe of escalating hilarity, while her husband Ricky Ricardo stands there shaking his head. The comedy was so total, so defining, that it became the entire frame. Lucille Ball was I Love Lucy, and I Love Lucy was Lucille Ball. And somewhere inside that equation, the actual woman, and especially the actual mother, disappeared. She had 2 children, Lucie Desiree Arnaz, born in 1951, and Desiderio Alberto Arnaz IV, known always as Desi Jr., born in 1953. Both of them grew up inside the most famous marriage on American television, which was also one of the most troubled marriages in Hollywood, which ended when they were still young in ways that left marks they are still describing in interviews today. Their stories are not simple. They are not the stories of children destroyed by privilege or undone by fame, though fame complicated everything. They are stories of 2 people who grew up inside a very specific kind of pressure, the pressure of being the children of a woman who was, depending on the moment, the funniest person alive, the hardest working person in the room, the most controlling person in the building, and a mother who loved them with an intensity that was not always easy to be on the receiving end of. To understand what happened to Lucie and Desi Jr., you first have to understand what it actually meant to be born into the family they were born into. And that requires going back to the beginning, to a girl from Celeron, New York, who had almost nothing, and who spent the next 60 years making sure she would never have nothing again. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The woman before the legend. Lucille Desiree Ball was born on August 6, 1911, in Jamestown, New York. She grew up in Celeron, a small lakeside community outside Jamestown, in circumstances that were by no measure comfortable. Her father, Henry Ball, died of typhoid fever when Lucille was 3 years old. Her mother, Dee Dee, was left with 2 small children and limited resources, and the family bounced between relatives for years in a way that Lucille would later describe with a terse precision that suggested the memory had not softened. Her maternal grandfather, Fred Hunt, was a significant early presence. He was a committed socialist, an eccentric, and a man who took his granddaughter's ambitions seriously at a time when girls with theatrical ambitions were not frequently taken seriously. When Lucille was 15, Dee Dee sent her to the John Murray Anderson School for the Dramatic Arts in New York City, where one of her classmates was Bette Davis. Lucille was told repeatedly by the school's instructors that she had no talent, that she should go home. She did not go home. Instead, she stayed in New York, took work as a model under the name Diane Belmont, appeared in the chorus of a few Broadway productions without distinction, contracted a severe case of rheumatoid arthritis at 18 that forced her back to Celeron for 2 years of near-total bed rest, and then returned to New York and eventually made her way to Hollywood. She arrived in Hollywood in 1933 as a Goldwyn girl, one of the decorative chorus performers who populated the musical numbers of early Hollywood spectaculars. She was 21 years old. She had already survived more setbacks than most people accumulate in a lifetime, and she had developed in response to those setbacks a quality that would define everything she did afterward. She was relentless, not in a romantic or inspirational sense, in a practical, almost mechanical sense. She simply did not stop. The 1930s and early 1940s were a long audition. She appeared in dozens of films in roles that ranged from small to smaller. She was the blonde showgirl, the wisecracking secretary, the decorative presence in the corner of the frame. The studios liked her looks and her professionalism, and did not know what to do with the thing underneath, which was a comic sensibility of an entirely different order than anything they were prepared to accommodate. She was not being overlooked exactly. She was being used in the wrong way by people who could not quite see what she was. She met Desi Arnaz in 1940 on the set of the film Too Many Girls, in which they both appeared. He was Cuban-born, 23 years old, the band leader who had made his name with conga, and he was exactly the kind of man who should have been wrong for her. He was charming and unreliable in equal measure, a night person in a world that required daytime discipline, someone whose relationship with fidelity would prove over the years to be theoretical at best. She was 10 years his senior, precise where he was impulsive, driven where he was driven but in an entirely different direction. They married 6 months after they met on November 30th, 1940, at the Byram River Beagle Club in Greenwich, Connecticut. The marriage was, from its first weeks, characterized by the specific tension of two very strong personalities who loved each other and could not consistently manage to inhabit the same space without creating friction. Desi toured with his band. Lucille worked in Hollywood. They were apart more than they were together. There were separations, there were reconciliations, there were rumors about Desi's infidelities that were consistent enough across enough independent sources that they had the density of fact. She had 2 miscarriages and 2 premature births that did not survive before she carried a pregnancy to term. This history is not incidental to the story of her children. It shaped the ferocity with which she held on to the 2 who lived. The factory that made the family famous. In 1950, Lucille Ball was a successful radio actress, the star of My Favorite Husband on CBS, and a woman who had spent 17 years in Hollywood without breaking into the upper tier. She was 40 years old. By the mathematics of a film industry that regarded women's careers as having an expiration date somewhere in the mid-30s, she should have been winding down. Instead, she and Desi formed Desilu Productions and pitched a television show to CBS. The network was interested. The network was not interested in Desi. CBS executives worried that audiences would not accept the Cuban bandleader as the husband of an all-American redhead. Lucille refused the show without Desi. The network capitulated. I Love Lucy premiered on October 15, 1951. Within 6 weeks, it was the most watched program on American television. Within a year, it was a national institution. Within 2 years, the episode in which Lucy Ricardo gave birth to little Ricky was watched by more Americans than Dwight Eisenhower's presidential inauguration, which took place the following morning. The birth episode aired on January 19, 1953. Lucille Ball's actual son, Desiderio Alberto Arnaz IV, was born by planned cesarean section on the same day, January 19, 1953. The coordination of the fictional birth and the real birth was no accident. It was Desilu, the production company that Lucille and Desi had built together, exercising a degree of control over its own narrative that was unprecedented in early television. They had negotiated with CBS, with their sponsors Philip Morris and Procter & Gamble, and with the network's Standards and Practices Department for the right to depict a pregnant woman on television, which was at the time considered too explicit for the medium, despite the logical difficulty of explaining how pregnancy had been contracted. They won that negotiation. The word pregnant was still not permitted on air, but Lucy Ricardo grew visibly through 9 months of scripted comedy, and the country watched transfixed. Lucie Desiree Arnaz had been born 2 years earlier, on July 17, 1951, 4 months before the show premiered. She was the first child. Desi Jr. arrived into a situation that was already different from his sisters in one significant respect. He had been born simultaneously with a television character, and the country had been watching for that character's arrival for months. He was not simply Lucille Ball's son, he was little Ricky's counterpart in the real world, and the press treated him as such, which meant he was photographed and discussed and wondered over from the moment of his birth with an intensity that even by Hollywood standards was unusual. What I Love Lucy created for this family, beyond the money and the fame and the 33 Emmy Awards that Desilu would eventually accumulate, was a public idea of them. The Ricardos were one kind of marriage, the Arnazes were another kind, and the children grew up understanding very early that the world had a strong and affectionate attachment to the first kind, and that the second kind was the one that was actually theirs, growing up inside the joke. To understand what childhood looked like for Lucie and Desi Jr., you have to appreciate the specific texture of the Arnaz household, which was not like other households, even other Hollywood households. Lucille Ball was, by every available account, a mother who was present, involved, fierce in her love, and not always easy. She was also simultaneously the head of a production company, the star of the most watched show on television, and a woman managing a marriage that was under significant private strain while presenting a very different version of that marriage to the American public every week. The children had nannies, they had tutors, they had the kind of material comfort that money could provide in abundance. They also had a mother who, when she was home, was fully home, who made holidays feel like productions, who insisted on family dinners with the same conviction she brought to production meetings, who sang to them and played with them and was genuinely, unmistakably, delightedly present. They also had a father who was often not there. Desi Arnaz's absences were partly logistical. He ran Desilu's business operations with a competence that is still underappreciated in the history of the company. He was the one who negotiated the deal that gave them ownership of their own show, which is why I Love Lucy still exists in archivable form rather than being lost to the live broadcast fate that consumed most early television. He was shrewd, hard-working when the work held his attention, and capable of genuine warmth. He was also an alcoholic. He was chronically unfaithful. He was someone whose marriage had been troubled almost from the start, and whose children's childhood was defined, in ways they have both described at length in interviews and memoirs, by the specific uncertainty of not knowing which version of their father would arrive. Lucie Arnaz, who has given the more publicly candid account of the two siblings about their childhood, described it in her 2022 memoir as something she spent years trying to understand from the inside, and then more years trying to understand from the outside. She said the Arnaz household was full of love and full of tension, and that the two things were not separable. They came as a package. She described watching her parents perform a marriage on television that bore a recognizable but not accurate resemblance to the marriage she actually lived inside. Lucie and Ricky Ricardo fought about money and stardom and the fundamental incompatibility of a wife who wanted to be in show business and a husband who wanted her to stay home. They resolved those fights in 30 minutes. The Arnazes fought about the same things and did not resolve them, and the children watched both versions and understood from a fairly early age that there was a difference. Desi Jr. has been less publicly detailed about the childhood years, but his account in interviews confirms the broad outlines. He has described his father as someone capable of tremendous generosity and tenderness, who is also someone whose drinking created an atmosphere of unpredictability that required children to be constantly calibrating. He has spoken about loving his father deeply and about the specific, complicated grief of loving someone who was not consistently available to be loved. The private life of the Arnaz household became something the children actively managed. There were things you did not say to reporters. There were images you were expected to maintain. By the time they were old enough to be interviewed themselves, Lucie and Desi Jr. had been doing media appearances since they could walk, and they had developed the particular fluency of children who have been coached, not dishonestly but carefully, in the art of saying true things that do not cause problems. The divorce and what it left behind. Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz divorced on May 4, 1960. The legal process was relatively quick and uncomplicated as Hollywood divorces go. The emotional aftermath was neither quick nor uncomplicated. Lucie was 8 years old. Desi Jr. was 7. The divorce was not a surprise within the family. The children had been living with its approach for years, had felt the temperature of the household shift, had learned to read their parents' silences with the specific literacy that children of troubled marriages develop. But the formality of it, the institutional confirmation that the family they had been was now the family they were no longer going to be, was something different from anticipating it. Lucille Ball was awarded primary custody. Desi Arnaz was given visitation rights. He was also given, in the settlement, a buyout of his half of Desilu Productions for around $2.5 million more, which Lucille and her business advisors had assessed as slightly below market value, but which Desi accepted because he wanted out and because his drinking had complicated his ability to sustain the kind of clear-headed negotiation that might have served him better. Desi moved to Del Mar, California, where he had a horse ranch. He remarried relatively quickly, wedding Edith Mack Hirsch in 1963. The marriage, by most accounts, was a genuinely happy one, the kind of second chapter that first chapters sometimes enable. He drank less. He seemed, by the reports of people who knew him during this period, more at ease with himself than he had been during the years of I Love Lucy. He was also less present in his children's lives than the custody arrangement technically required. The visits happened. They were not the organizing principle of his daily existence in the way that Lucille's organizing of her children's lives was the organizing principle of hers. Lucie and Desi Jr. loved their father, and they also spent significant portions of their childhood learning how to love someone at a distance, which is a skill that requires more effort than it should. Lucille, for her part, moved forward with a velocity that was characteristic. In November 1961, she married Gary Morton, a stand-up comedian 13 years her junior who had been introduced to her through mutual friends. Gary Morton was, by every account, a gentle, supportive, uncomplicated man, which was precisely what the situation required after Desi Arnaz. He was not a father figure to Lucie and Desi Jr. in the active sense of the term. He was something slightly different and in some ways more useful. He was a stable presence. He was consistent. He did not drink too much or disappear. He was there. Lucie has spoken about Gary Morton with warmth in the years since. She has described him as someone who understood his role in the household, who did not try to replace their father, and who provided the specific kind of steadiness that their mother needed, and that by extension created a more manageable environment for them. He made their mother easier to be around, which is not a small thing when your mother is Lucille Ball. The question of how the divorce shaped what followed in both children's lives is something that Lucie has addressed more directly and with more sustained self-examination than most children of famous people. She has talked about it in interviews and in her memoir with a psychological candor that is unusual in a world where such candor is often managed carefully. She has said that she spent years trying to earn her mother's approval in ways that she now understands were both understandable and not entirely healthy. She has said that growing up with parents who were the most famous couple on American television created specific difficulties around her own sense of identity, around the question of who she was when she was not their daughter. These are not dramatic statements, they are precise ones, and their precision is itself a piece of the story. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lucie Arnaz, the daughter who had to find herself. Lucie Desiree Arnaz was the eldest and, in certain ways that matter, the one who bore the weight of primogeniture most visibly. She was the first child of a famous marriage. She was a girl in a household defined by an extraordinarily powerful woman. She was, by her own account, someone who needed her mother's approval in ways she did not fully understand until she was considerably older. She was also, from the beginning, someone who was going to perform. That was never really in question. She was Lucille Ball's daughter and Desi Arnaz's daughter, and she had been around stages and sets since before she could remember them. The talent was real. It was not borrowed from her parents' fame, though it was impossible to separate entirely from it. She sang well. She could do comedy. She had a quality of engagement on stage that her mother recognized and her father recognized, and that audiences responded to when she finally got in front of them. The path to getting in front of them was not as simple as her last name suggested it should be. She made her formal entertainment debut as a teenager, appearing with her mother in various capacities as Lucille Ball transitioned from I Love Lucy into Here's Lucy in the late 1960s. The show, which ran from 1968 to 1974, featured Lucie and Desi Jr. as regular cast members, playing their mother's children within the sitcom's fictional universe, while also being, of course, actually her children. It was a casting decision that had the practical virtue of keeping the family together professionally while creating a dynamic that was, for the children, worth examining. Playing your own mother's child on television when your own mother is Lucille Ball is an experience with no real analog. The comedy was different from I Love Lucy in tone, broader and more broadly contemporary, but the core of it was still their mother at the center of every scene, the gravitational force around which everything orbited. Lucie and Desi Jr. were in her orbit in the literal sense and in the professional sense simultaneously, and the skills required to maintain your own sense of self in that situation are not negligible. Lucie managed it, though she has acknowledged it cost her something. She was not simply learning her craft on television, she was learning her craft on television while playing a version of herself that was defined entirely by her relationship to her mother. The character was her, the mother was her actual mother, and the lines between performance and family relationship were, in ways that were sometimes clarifying and sometimes extremely confusing, not entirely separable. She left Here's Lucy when the show ended in 1974 and began building her own career. She appeared in Broadway productions that proved she could hold a stage independently. She starred in the touring company of They're Playing Our Song. She took roles that were her own rather than appendages to her mother's legacy, and she was good in them, good enough that audiences who came expecting to see Lucille Ball's daughter left having seen a performer in her own right. In 1980, she married Lawrence Luckinbill, an actor 11 years her senior. They had 5 children together. The marriage has lasted, which in the context of the family history she was born into, is a statement that carries weight. She has spoken about Luckinbill with consistent warmth over the decades, describing him as someone who grounded her, who helped her understand things about herself that the noise of her upbringing had made difficult to hear. She has also spoken at length, particularly in recent years, about her mother. The picture that emerges from those conversations is not the simple one. It is not the narrative of a cruel or cold or absent parent. It is something more complicated and more interesting. Lucille Ball was by all accounts a mother who showed up, who was present, who cared with an intensity that was sometimes overwhelming, and who was simultaneously someone whose own formidable personality created a specific kind of difficulty for a daughter who needed to develop a self that was not a reflection of that personality. The perfectionism was real. Lucille Ball had built an empire out of being better at her work than anyone expected her to be. That standard, the standard of relentless excellence, the standard of there is always something that could be done better, was not left at the studio door when she came home. It came with her. And for a daughter who was also performing, also in the business, also subject to professional evaluation in ways that would inevitably be compared to a standard set by the most successful woman in television history, that perfectionism was sometimes hard to breathe near. Lucie has described moments in her career when she would receive a review or a note or a piece of feedback, and her first thought was not what her own assessment of the work had been, but what her mother's assessment would be. That is a specific kind of internal occupation that takes years to understand and years more to work through. She has done the work. You can hear it in the way she talks about it, with specificity and without bitterness, which is the accomplishment of someone who has processed something rather than merely survived it. Her relationship with her mother deepened in the final years of Lucille Ball's life, when illness began to limit what Lucille could do and the dynamic shifted in the way that the dynamics between parents and adult children sometimes do in the approach of the end. Lucie was present. She was involved in her mother's care. She has described those years with a combination of difficulty and tenderness that suggests the relationship had by then found a shape that worked for both of them. Lucille Ball died on April 26, 1989, of an acute aortic aneurysm. She was 77 years old. She had been in the hospital for 6 days following open heart surgery, and she had been improving, and then she was not. The speed of it was one of the things that caught people off guard. She had seemed to be recovering. Lucie was 57 years old. Desi Jr. was 55. They were adults who had been navigating their relationship with their mother for decades, and who were also, in the oldest and most irreducible sense, children who had just lost their mother. The two things existed simultaneously, as they always do. Lucie has spoken in the years since about the grief of that loss in ways that reflect her characteristic directness. She has said it was not simple. She has said her mother was not a simple person. She has said that loving someone who is not simple is itself not simple, and that grief for someone who is not simple is also not simple, and that the combination of those truths is something she is still carrying even now, decades later, in the way that some losses do not finish being losses. The particular burden carried by the son. Desi Arnaz Jr. was born famous. This is not a metaphor. He arrived on January 19, 1953, the same day the fictional Lucie Ricardo gave birth to little Ricky on the most watched television show in America, and the press treated both events with approximately equal excitement. He was 7 weeks old when the photograph of him in his mother's arms was on the cover of a national magazine. He had been culturally anticipated before he was personally present. The weight of that kind of beginning is difficult to calculate because it is not a single thing. It is a texture, a daily condition, a baseline fact of existence that shapes everything it touches without announcing itself as the shaping force. Desi Jr. grew up knowing that the world had a prior relationship with the idea of him. He was little Ricky's real-world counterpart in the cultural imagination of an entire country. That is a strange thing to be. He was also, and this is worth stating clearly, enormously talented. He could play the drums by the time he was 8, having been taught by his father, who was himself a genuinely skilled musician. He had his father's magnetic quality on stage, the ease of someone for whom performing was not an act but a mode of being. He had his mother's comic instincts, the ability to find the shape of a joke from the inside. He was, by the time he was a teenager, a genuinely gifted performer. He was also a teenager in the 1960s in Los Angeles, which was one of the more complicated places and times to be that particular thing. The 1960s in Los Angeles produced a specific kind of available excess. There was money and drugs and parties and a social world structured around the entertainment industry, in which the children of famous people were both special and ordinary, because everyone around them was also special, also the child of someone famous, also moving through a world in which normal rules of consequence seemed to apply with less consistency than they did elsewhere. The specific combination of privilege and dislocation that characterized Hollywood adolescence in that era is something that a number of children of that generation have described, each in their own way, as a kind of trap that was not visible until you were already in it. Desi Jr. moved through it with a charisma that attracted attention and a vulnerability that was not always visible beneath the charisma. He formed relationships quickly and intensely. He fell in love with people who were themselves in complicated places. By the time he was 17, he was dating a woman who was considerably older than him, a pattern that would repeat in different forms across the next several years. The most publicly visible of his early relationships was with Patty Duke, the Oscar-winning actress who was 14 years his senior. The relationship began when Desi was 15 and Patty was 29, and it generated a level of press attention that reflected the era's comfort with age differentials that contemporary standards would read very differently. The relationship ended when Patty Duke discovered she was pregnant. She would later write in her memoir that the child she was carrying was not Desi's, though the question was publicly contested at the time. The episode was complicated for everyone involved and left marks that Desi has acknowledged took time to process. He later had a relationship with Liza Minnelli, Judy Garland's daughter, which was significant enough to be taken seriously by both families and which produced a level of combined celebrity offspring scrutiny that was genuinely remarkable, even by Hollywood standards. 2 children of 2 legendary entertainment figures dating in an industry that watched everything, while both of them were still in the process of figuring out who they were when they were not defined by who their parents were. The relationship ultimately ended without a formal engagement, though both parties have spoken about it with warmth in subsequent years. He formed the band Dino, Desi, and Billy with Dean Martin's son Dino Martin and their friend Billy Hinchy, and the band had genuine commercial success in the mid-1960s, with several charting singles and a record deal with Reprise. The success was real, not simply the result of famous last names, though the famous last names did not hurt with radio programmers. They appeared on television. They toured. For a brief period, Desi Jr. was a pop star, which is a specific category of fame with its own specific properties. Pop stardom at 17, when you are already the son of the most famous woman on American television and the grandson of a famous band leader, and you have grown up in a household where the cameras were always somewhere close, produces a relationship with public attention that is different from the relationship that ordinary people have with it. It was not strange to him. It was the water he had always swum in. What he was still figuring out was what was underneath the water. He married Linda Pearl in 1980. Linda Pearl was an actress and a singer, someone with her own professional identity, and the marriage had the quality of two people who had found each other at a moment when both were trying to build something that was theirs rather than inherited. It lasted, and then it did not. They divorced after less than a year, the specific brevity of it suggesting that whatever had seemed possible at the beginning had not sustained the encounter with dailiness. The question of what Desi Jr. was building in his 20s and 30s is one that he has answered with a frankness in interviews that is worth paying attention to. He has spoken about the drug use of those years, which was not incidental to the period, and which he has described as something he managed for a while and then did not manage. He has spoken about the specific difficulty of establishing an identity when you have grown up not just famous, but famous as the son of famous people, which creates a doubled question of selfhood. Who are you when you are not your mother's child? Who are you when you are not the boy who was born on the same day as little Ricky? Those are not easy questions to answer in your 20s when you are also in the entertainment industry and also managing the specific pressures that come with being expected to succeed in a field that your parents defined. His mother watched all of this. She was not an observer by temperament. Lucille Ball was someone who acted, who fixed, who solved, who produced results through the application of sufficient force and intelligence and work. Watching her son struggle in ways that could not be fixed by any of those mechanisms was a form of helplessness she was not well equipped for. She was also, by multiple accounts, not consistently equipped to separate her love from her need for him to succeed. The perfectionism that had built her career and built Desilu applied to her children in the way that such things tend to apply. She wanted them to be well, she also wanted them to be impressive. And when the two desires were not compatible, the friction between them was real and was felt. Desi Jr. has spoken about his mother in terms that are loving and also honest. He has said she was not perfect and that she would not have claimed to be. He has said she was easier to know from a certain distance than from close proximity, which is something children of formidable parents often say and which is not a condemnation, merely an observation about the specific physics of intimacy with someone who takes up a great deal of space. The years on the ranch and the finding of ground. Desi Jr.'s story takes a turn in the 1980s that is less publicly documented than the earlier years and more important. He moved to Colorado. He married Amy Laura Bargiel in 1987, and the marriage took hold in ways his earlier relationship had not. They had a daughter together, Lucie Arnaz, born in 1992. He found in the domestic life he built on a ranch outside of Pueblo something that the Hollywood world had not provided, which was a relationship between what he did daily and who he actually was. He raised horses. He spent time outdoors. He was, by accounts of people who knew him during this period, more at ease with himself than he had been in a long time. Amy Bargiel Arnaz died in 2015 after a short illness. The marriage had lasted nearly 30 years. Desi Jr. has spoken about her death in terms that make clear what the loss meant, which was the loss of the person around whom the life he had built was organized. He has described the years following her death as a period of recalibration, of figuring out what the structure of things looked like without her at the center of it. His daughter Haley has spoken about her father with the warmth of someone who grew up with a parent who was present, who was there for the ordinary events, not just the extraordinary ones, who made the ranch and the horses and the Colorado winters feel like home rather than exile from somewhere more important. She has described a grandmother, Lucille Ball, who visited and who was not the terrifying television legend in those visits, but simply a grandmother, someone who paid attention to what Haley was interested in and talked to her about it. The transformation between what Desi Jr.'s earlier life looked like and what his life in Colorado looked like is not a simple narrative of redemption because it was not simple. It was a person figuring out, later than he might have hoped and earlier than it could have gone the other way, what he actually needed. What he actually needed turned out to be considerably quieter and more ordinary than what he had been trying for in his 20s. He returned to acting periodically through the 80s and 90s, appearing in television movies and series without seeking the kind of front-of-mind celebrity that had characterized his earlier career. The roles were his own, not extensions of his parents' legacies, and the decision not to be constantly in the public eye seemed to be one he had made deliberately rather than arrived at by default. His father, Desi Arnaz, died on December 2, 1986, of lung cancer. He was 69 years old. He had been living at the Del Mar Ranch with Edith, and he had spent the last years of his life in relative peace, making wine, watching horse racing, receiving visitors. He and Lucille Ball had maintained a warmth after the divorce that is worth noting, a friendship built on 20 years of marriage and the shared experience of raising two children who needed them to be able to be in the same room. They spoke by phone regularly. In his final days, Lucille called him. He told her he loved her. She told him she loved him. That exchange has been reported by multiple people who were present in those years, and it carries the weight of something genuine, a love that had been real and had been mismanaged and had then, in the long aftermath of the marriage, settled into something that was neither romantic nor entirely severed. Desi Jr. was 33 when his father died. He had had the experience in his 20s of being present in his father's life in ways that the divorce had complicated but not prevented, of going to the ranch in Del Mar, of watching his father make his peace with things that had not gone the way he had hoped. The relationship between them, like most relationships between fathers and sons of complicated temperaments, was not simple, but it was real. He was there when his father died. He has spoken about that with a directness that suggests it mattered, which of course it did. What Lucille Ball actually built and what it cost. By the late 1960s, Lucille Ball was running Desilu Productions on her own, following Desi's buyout in 1962, and she was running it with a competence that continues to surprise people who encounter the history without the prior knowledge. She was the first woman to run a major Hollywood production studio. Under her leadership, Desilu produced Star Trek and Mission Impossible, among other shows. She made creative and business decisions that shaped the course of American television in ways that are still playing out. She sold Desilu to Gulf and Western in 1967 for $17 million, retaining her own production company, Lucille Ball Productions, through which she continued to work. The money was extraordinary by any measure. The professional accomplishment was extraordinary by any measure. What did not make it into the press releases was the cost that those accomplishments extracted, not from her alone, but from the people around her who loved her and needed her, and who were not always able to reach her through the professional fortress she had built. Her son has described, in various interviews given over several decades, the experience of growing up with a mother who was the head of a studio and also trying to be his mother, and who did not always know how to be both things at once. He has said she tried. He has been consistent about saying she tried. He has also been honest about the trying not always succeeding, about the moments when the head of the studio was more present than the mother, about the times when the perfectionism that had built the empire was aimed at him and his sister in ways that were difficult to receive. Lucie has been more precise about this in recent years. She has described a mother who managed her children with a degree of oversight that was intense even by the standards of hands-on Hollywood parenting, who had opinions about everything and expressed them, who was simultaneously her greatest champion and someone whose championship came wrapped in a level of expectation that was not always comfortable. These are not complaints exactly, they are observations. The distinction matters. Both children have been consistent across decades of interviews and a collective body of commentary that now spans nearly 70 years in expressing genuine love for their mother, genuine admiration for what she built, and genuine complexity about what it was like to grow up inside what she built. Those three things coexist without resolving into a simpler story, and the fact that both of them have resisted simplifying the story is itself a piece of information about who they are. The legacy and what the children do with it. Lucille Ball's estate was valued at roughly $40 million at the time of her death in 1989, which reflected a lifetime of earnings, real estate holdings, and the residual value of a television catalog that had never stopped being watched. I Love Lucy had been in continuous rerun since 1953. It would go on being in continuous rerun. The royalties did not stop. The management of the estate and the management of Lucille Ball's legacy became, in the years following her death, a matter of some complexity. Her husband Gary Morton remained involved in certain aspects of the estate until his own death in 1999. Lucie and Desi Jr. took roles in protecting and promoting their mother's image that were active and ongoing. Lucie, in particular, became the public face of the Ball legacy in ways that were both natural and consequential. She gave interviews, she worked with museums and television specials, she wrote her memoir, she spoke at events that celebrated her mother's work and her mother's place in the history of television and the history of American comedy. She did all of this with a generosity that suggests genuine pride in the legacy, alongside the genuine complexity of having lived inside it. She was also an active participant in the correction of the public record when it needed correcting. When various productions and projects took liberties with the story of her parents' marriage, she responded, sometimes publicly, sometimes through more private channels, but always with the conviction of someone who knew what had actually happened and found the distance between what had actually happened and what was being depicted to be something worth closing. This became most visible with the 2021 film Being the Ricardos, the Aaron Sorkin-written drama about a week in the production of I Love Lucy. Lucie was publicly critical of aspects of the film's depiction of her parents, particularly of Nicole Kidman's casting in the role of her mother, which she considered mismatched. She was careful in how she expressed the criticism, specific rather than sweeping, but she expressed it, and the expression itself was a piece of her relationship with the legacy, the ongoing work of someone who was present when the events occurred and who has a stake in how they are told. Desi Jr. has been less publicly active in the management of the legacy, which is consistent with a general temperament that tends toward the private. He has given interviews. He has spoken warmly about his mother's work and about the significance of what she and his father built. He has not been the engine of preservation in the way his sister has. He has been, in the years since the ranch and since his wife's death, someone who seems to have found a way to carry the name without being carried away by it. Both children's health has been a topic of periodic concern in recent years. Both are now in their early 70s, the natural boundary of the generation that grew up in post-war Hollywood. They carry the physical and emotional history of lives that have been long and full and not always easy. They carry the name that is the most recognizable in the history of television comedy. They carry the complicated love of two extraordinary and imperfect parents who loved them fiercely and who also, in being what they were, made being their children both a privilege and a weight. The photograph again. You can return now to the photograph at the restaurant. Lucille Ball laughing at something one of her children has said, shoulders up, genuinely gone into the laugh. Lucie beside her. Desi Jr. across the table. Knowing what you know now, the photograph looks different. You can see what each person at that table was carrying. You know that the daughter at her mother's elbow had spent years learning to find herself inside a force field of someone else's personality, and had done it and was still doing it. You know that the son across the table had spent years trying to figure out who he was when he was not the boy born on the same day as little Ricky, and had found part of the answer in Colorado, and was still finding the rest. You know that the woman at the center of the photograph had built an empire and a family with equal determination, and had not always been able to distinguish between the two, and that the people who loved her had spent their lives navigating the specific terrain that created. The laugh is still real. That is not nothing. In a life as complicated as the one this family lived, real laughter at a restaurant table is actually quite a lot. Lucille Ball said in interviews late in her life that she was proud of her children. She said it the way she said most things, without excess sentiment, as a statement of fact. She had raised two people who had found their own lives, who had not been destroyed by the circumstances of their birth, or the size of her shadow, or the complications of their father's absence, who were still there. The comedy was the thing the world remembers. The diamonds, in her case, were the work, the Emmys, the production company, the image of a woman on a factory floor surrounded by chocolate she cannot contain. Those are immortal. They are also not the whole of it. The whole of it includes a daughter who learned, eventually, how to be herself inside the long shadow of her mother's genius. It includes a son who found his footing in Colorado and held onto it through grief and loss, and the ordinary, extraordinary difficulty of a life lived fully. It includes two people who, when asked about the woman who was their mother, do not give simple answers, because the woman was not simple, because they are not simple, because nothing about what they went through was simple, and they are honest enough not to pretend otherwise. That honesty is, in the end, the most Lucille Ball thing about them. She never pretended it was simple either. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.